Okay, hi everyone. I guess we're ready to go. I think it's kind of self-service apparently when it comes to the recording, and I think it's going. So welcome to this session about legacy migrations. I think it's billed as a discussion. We kind of changed up the format a little bit. That I had a presentation I was going to give about just project management and how I'm conceptualizing my migration, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to kind of give a brief introduction. But I have my slides shareable at the website afterwards, and you can look along with those however you like, for better, for worse. But we have Celia here and Bria, and I'm John, and we're going to talk about legacy migrations, about non-structured data for the most part. So this is not covering things like Archivist Toolkit migration, because there's tooling for that already. This is for legacy data migrations. And during the QA, we're also open to having discussions about project management ideas, feature tracking tools, migrating other kinds of unstructured data, or rethinking finding aid versus as a document versus data. So for me, as a new ArchivesSpace person, that's a real big challenge for me, is understanding ArchivesSpace, number one, but then making the switch from XML as a document versus ArchivesSpace as data. So we're also welcome to answer questions about that as well. So again, our intent today is to offer some conceptual ideas, tools, and techniques, as well as some pitfalls to avoid to help everyone succeed migrating structured data that does not come from Archivist Toolkit or Archive. So we're not talking about things like Word documents or PDFs. We assume that data is already structured in some way. All three of us have data of this type, either native EAD or local XML, CSV or TSV tabular data, and MARC records. Not only is it important to consider the technical aspects of architecting a data migration, but for those of us with age-old data or coming to an ArchivesSpace management system for the first time, it's also a chance to rethink our encoding practices and descriptive practices, as well as chances to enhance our data with an eye to the future, not just consider our legacy practices. For me, I'm thinking about the new changes in DAX that's been kind of percolating the last couple of years. And linked data is a big topic of discussion in our library at LM too, so those use cases are also valid here. We think these scenarios will resonate with you, but we hope you see yourselves in our data, and if you don't, please ask us questions about how your data can be like our data. So Celia's going to go first, and please welcome her with her description about migrating XML resources in ArchivesSpace.
Hi everyone, I'm Celia. Just a little bit of background. So I work at the Friends Historical Library. It's a Quaker archives at Swarthmore College, and we're part of a library consortium with Bryn Mawr and Haverford College. So I serve as the ArchivesSpace application administrator for all three schools. And in the process of migrating to ArchivesSpace, I ingested about 1,200 EAD files, about 300 MARC records. So not a big number, not a giant number. Important caveat to note is that I did this in 2016, so some things may have changed since then. There are some things that I know have changed since then, but I'm going to talk about my process at that time. And something else I want to mention is that I'm not a programmer. I'm not going to talk about anything that requires extensive technical expertise. What Bria is going to talk about is a little more on the tech side, but I'm going to talk about using tools, especially Oxygen, which is an XML editor. So first, getting ready. The first step, of course, is to gather together all of your XML files. So EAD is the main one for us, and we had a few different generations of EAD files. And this is important because even though they're all EAD, we were following different conventions, and there are different fields that were consistently used or consistently avoided depending on the generation. We also had MARC records, so all of our EAD files also had a MARC record, but there were some collections that were only represented in MARC, so I wanted to deal with those as well. So I just want to very briefly talk about this tool called MarcEdit that was really useful for one simple task. It's free, it's easy to download, so I had asked our cataloger to export all the relevant bib records, and she did that, and then she gave me all of these MARC files, and I didn't know what to do with them. I needed them in MARC XML in order to work with them. So this is the simple process, and these slides will all be online, so I apologize if it's hard to see. But basically, I'm just running a batch process. So click on Tools, Mark Processing Tools, Batch Process Records, and then you can have a folder on your desktop of Mark records and convert them to Mark XML. It's very simple. So that's all I did with that. Oxygen is the tool that I'm going to be talking about for a lot of the presentation today. It's not free, but it's very reasonably priced, especially if you're at an academic institution like me. It's just $100 and like $60 a year to renew. They also do have a free 30-day trial, so you can plan in advance and get all your files together and really quick do all the work in 30 days. That sounds stressful. But I think you're going to like Oxygen, and this is not a commercial for it, but I think you're going to like using it.
I like it too.
Yeah. Another really important part of my preparation was doing research, reading all the brilliant blog posts by brilliant colleagues at other institutions about the work they did. So these are some of the ones that were the most useful to me. If you go to Awesome ArchivesSpace, there's a whole section on migrations that links to useful blogs. So I encourage everyone to check that out. All right, so that's the background. I've gathered together my tools, ready to get started. One really useful thing to do is to start testing a few records. Try testing the imports. If you have a development server, that's awesome. If you don't have a development server, I strongly urge you to test your imports in the sandbox rather than in your production server. And the reason for that is that there's some extra gunk that comes in with your gunky EAD or MARC records, particularly the subjects and agents. So if I import my EAD, I decide it's all messed up and I delete it, that's gonna delete my notes and my components, but the subjects and agents I've imported are going to stay in my database. And that's particularly a problem because subjects and agents don't parse well on the import, so I'm losing the subdivisions, and the names are coming in as one unit, they're not parsed last name, first name, dates the way ArchivesSpace likes them, so be careful about that. When you are testing your imports, you are going to run into a lot of errors that can look pretty cryptic. So here is an example of one. And I would encourage you to not be afraid of this and to actually try and look at it and understand it, because I have found that I'm able to understand a lot of the error messages. So this is one that I noticed a lot. The end dates were before the start dates in some of my my normalized dates. And then there's this garbled mess that says JSON model archival object, and it looks like it's all nonsense. But if I just keep scrolling and look all the way to the end, often you can find something intelligible that'll let you locate where the problem is in your file. So if you see a green error message like that, don't freak out. Try and look at it. You're smart. You can figure it out. If you can't figure it out, here's another really useful tool. So Mark Custer developed a EAD validation schematron, and I'll talk about how to use this in a moment. But basically, you validate all of your files against this, and it will translate those some of the common errors into something that is human readable, so that you can understand what's going on. A couple really important caveats to this are, number one, that he made this several years ago and ArchivesSpace has changed since then, so it's not flagging all the errors, and it's flagging some errors that have been fixed. And another thing is that some of these rules are specific to Yale, so it's not actually something that ArchivesSpace will block, it's just something that Yale wants its EAD to conform to. So take everything with a grain of salt, but if there's it can help you identify a lot of errors, or if you're banging your head against the wall about one file, this can be a useful thing to do. So this is showing you how to do it in Oxygen, and it's really actually very simple, couple steps. You just, there's a validate button, validate with schema, and you just put in the URL, and that's it. And it'll run on your files and flag the errors. Another useful thing I want to point out On the ArchivesSpace website, there are import and export maps. Again, they're pretty out of date. So this is a mapping from 2013, and there have been changes since then. But it's a useful thing to know about and to review if you have a field that you think should be importing and you can't find it in ArchivesSpace. You can look at the import-export map to see if it's accounted for and where that information is supposed to be going. Big plug here for Jira to look at it and contribute to it. So if something is wonky, if a field, you think that there's a field that's disappearing or you think it's displaying poorly, look in Jira to see if someone else has noticed the problem. And if you see it there, vote for it so that the prioritization team knows it's important to lots of people in the community. And if it's not there, add it as an issue so that they can find it and fix it. All right, so now I'm going to talk for a while about using Oxygen specifically and hopefully convince you that it's a worthwhile tool. So this is just a preview of the kind of thing that Oxygen can do. So I've got a whole bunch of files and say I want to do a find and replace, and it'll let me preview, which is super nice. So before it makes all those changes, it'll let me click through all the places it thinks it should make a change and make sure it's going to do what I want it to do. So on the left is what the file looks like. The right is what it would look like after it makes the change I want. So I think this is amazing. I love it. If you're working in Oxygen, what you want to do is create a new project, and this will let you do batch processes on a whole bunch of records at once. And you can add individual files, or you can add folders. So if you have different generations of EAD, for instance, where you might want to be doing different operations on different batches, you can put them in folders and kind of selectively do processes. So here's an example of a problem. Say I need to find and replace text in a bunch of files. And my example here is that a repository has changed the name they like to refer to themselves in records. This is super easy. Next slide, please. This is super easy in Oxygen. There's a find and replace. And so I just put in the text to find and the text to replace. It'll do it in all the files. Fabulous. It's good for that use case. Here are a few other use cases. I had a lot of non-standard dashes, particularly in the subjects, and just changed all of those at once. A lot of our subjects had an extra period at the end. I got rid of all of those in one easy step. Here's another example of a problem I had. I wanted to delete a tag and anything it contains against all my files. So in my case, this is because all of our EAD files, when we had a note, we had a head tag for how we wanted that note to be labeled. So like arrangement tag, we had organization of the records as a head. We decided we didn't want that to come into ArchivesSpace because we were just going to make a change in the YAML file to change the way it displayed in the PUI so it would be consistent across everything. So we didn't want to bring this data into ArchivesSpace. So I don't know RegX. RegX is a language that lets you, it's sort of like for searching. It's a like abstracted language for searching, and Bria's going to talk about this and define it well, so you can just hold on to that thought. This is just proving I don't know what it is. I don't need to know what it is. I only know like a couple RegX expressions, but a little bit goes a really long way. So here's one thing I know. Period and asterisk means anything. So up there, circled in red, you can see the text that I'm finding is anything that appears in a head tag. And I've clicked that button to tell Oxygen I mean a regular expression, and I'm replacing it with nothing because I want to delete it. And if I hit that replace all button, it's just going to find all the head tags in all of my XML files and delete them. It's great. Saved me so much time. Here's another example of a problem. I want to make a change, but only in a certain field. And my example of this is our repositories decided that we were going to add a prefix to our identifiers for all our separate repositories. So now I have to add SFHL to the beginning of all of my call numbers. but only, here's the hitch, only at the collection level. So if I have like series 1, series 2, subseries A and B, I don't want to touch those, just at the collection level. So my solution here is a tiny bit of XPath. And XPath is a language that lets you navigate through an XML file and locate exactly where you are in an XML file. The syntax is pretty simple, so it's just basically, so here I'm just looking at / the name of the node / the name of the next node, so that I'm going down through the way it's nested. So here I'm looking for text. I'm only looking in the ArchDesk section. I'm not looking in the DSC section. That's the key point here. And I'm just replacing my unit ID. Unit ID, I want to start now with unit ID SFHL. And I hit the replace all button, fixed in all my files. Oxygen makes it easy for you to identify the XPath, so you don't need to really know XPath. It'll just tell you what to do. So if I select a place in a file, at the top there, circled in red, is the generic XPath. So you can see it's EAD, ArchDesk, DSC, CO1, CO2, DID, unit title. That's the whole XPath. If I right-click on it and select Copy XPath, it gives me an even more specific XPath. That's what I have displayed here. So it's telling me it's the first ArchDesk, it's the first DSC, it's the third CO1. And this could be really useful if I wanted to make a change in a file, but say I only wanted to touch the first series or the third series. If I wanted to make a change, but only in that specific area, this would let me do that. And this was super, super helpful when I was looking at my MARC records. So one thing that I was looking for was in agent names, we had like B period for all the birth dates, which is not practice anymore. Now you're supposed to do the date and then the dash. So I wanted to find all of those and fix them. And so I was able to use this feature with XPath where you can select an attribute. And so I was only looking at the 600, only looking at the 100, then all of those MARC tags. And so that let me look whenever I found a B period in that particular MARC tag, and then I could go through and fix all of those. Here's another example of a file. Say I want to review the contents of a tag everywhere it appears. So I wanted to look at my access restrictions and all of my finding aids and make sure that we were using something that was reasonably consistent. So here I'm using just a little bit of XPath knowledge. If I have // it'll show me a tag wherever it appears. So I'm looking for // access restrict, whether it's at the collection level, at the item level, at the series level, anywhere it is. And here I'm using my one RegX expression again, period asterisk. So I'm just looking for everything that's in any access restriction tag wherever it appears, and then I can look at all of those and verify. So this is what that looks like. And this is something I wasn't making a bulk change, I was just looking at them, kind of browsing. And I'm out of time, so I have an extra credit problem that I can come back to in the Q&A if it's of use to people, but basically I made a list of all of the tags I was using in my MARC, and then comparing them against the ImportExport Map. So I'll go into more detail later if people are interested. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm Bria Parker. I'm the head of Discovery and Metadata Services at University of Maryland. So I'll preface this with I'm not an archivist, I'm just the metadata person. And I'll be focusing today on the tools that we used at University of Maryland to deal with archival metadata in CSV or comma-separated format. So if you haven't used CSV before, just think Excel spreadsheets, but with a different file extension. So, and since we were not migrating from Archivist Toolkit or Archon, but rather an Access database, the CSV format became very crucial, particularly in working with our accessions metadata and later for some legacy finding aids. And there wasn't like a single magical solution, and there was like no one tool to rule them all. And we did not have all the resources ourselves to like develop our own tool to do that. So in the end, it was a very iterative process where basically we would go through, kind of clean off the first layer of gunk, and then that would expose more problems, and then we'd go back through and clean out the next layer of gunk. So like I said, our legacy archival system resided in an Access database that we had lovingly named the Beast. That's like live footage of the Beast right there. Having the data in a database does provide the opportunity and ability to maintain a semblance of structure in the data. However, after years of use by many people, many years, quirks form, people have different practices, things change, and honest, innocent errors get made in data entry. It happens. So our legacy data was certainly not consistent. I'll start by talking about accessions, which is what we started with because we figured this is low-hanging fruit. This will be easy. And also because ArchivesSpace already had a built-in function for importing accession CSV. Like that already existed when we started 4 years ago doing this. But we still had a lot of work to do to get our data like from the export from the Access database and into the accessions template that ArchivesSpace expected. So there was a lot of cleanup and normalization to do. And for that, I used OpenRefine. Who here has used OpenRefine? Who here has heard of OpenRefine? Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about OpenRefine. That's one of the tools in my tool belt. OpenRefine is kind of like the Swiss Army knife for metadata librarians because it kind of does a little bit of everything, and it's a lot more powerful than it looks when you first open it. And we were really able to use it for just about all of the normalization work we needed for accessions. It allowed us to normalize date formats. We could use facets and clustering to kind of normalize and apply controlled vocabularies for things like extent types. And we also were able to use faceting and to find and remediate data inconsistencies. We couldn't escape manual work since some errors it was due to missing data and someone had to go back to the control file. It just happens. Little time intensive, but it's better doing it for like a handful than for all of them. So let's move on. So there's some links where to install OpenRefine, and I think a few tutorials or information on using OpenRefine that are useful. In this last one, I did a lot of work with the process that they did at the Bentley. Is anyone here from the Bentley? Because I love you and you're wonderful. These slides will be posted so you'll be able to get those links off it later. So extent types. I needed to normalize extent types to a controlled vocabulary. And this is like not even all of the ways we found it represented the data. Caitlin's shaking her head because she knows. So into OpenRefine, how am I going to deal with these? So each column in OpenRefine, I'm going to stand up and point, has these little triangles, and so each column basically has a menu of actions that you can perform on the data in that column. So with extent types, I could use a facet function, that text facet, and it will show me, it will grab all occurrences of that text and tell me how many there are. So here you can see, this is, I think, after one iteration, so there's only 2 instances of linear feet, but why is this, they look the same, right? No, there's like a space, and that's freaking it out. So it allows me to go through and find more inconsistent, like items. And you can edit them in line in this. You see where that's sort of highlighted, you can click edit it right there and remove the space you need to. I already did that one. And OpenRefine also makes use of some clustering. If you see that button at the top right, you might not be able to see it. That uses some clustering algorithms to try and make your job easier for you so you don't have to try and find all of them in that list. This isn't actually like from ArchivesSpace, but it was a really good example of how little things can really like mess up a controlled vocabulary. So there's a period, there's a space and then a period, so all of these, and it goes through and says, hey, what do you want that new cell value to be? And you can click if you want it to merge, and it will just go through, and you can see how many rows it can go through at once. You don't have to go and find it or sort it yourself and do all of that nonsense. So it is a very handy tool. Date normalization was another issue that we addressed, and OpenRefine helped us a lot for that. And this is when I mentioned the Bentley library. They have this whole, if you go to their blog and click on the tag cloud, click Date Saga, they take you through this whole beautiful journey of, they worked with finding aids, but they had pulled dates out of the XML into CSV. So all of the processing they did on the CSV, I could replicate for doing this. So I'm not going to talk about XML because she did that, but I'll talk about the CSV portion of it. So the big tool in OpenRefine for dealing with dates and normalizing them was regular expressions, which Celia mentioned briefly. So they are a way of representing alphanumeric patterns that in this case we could use for kind of sophisticated find and replace operations. So once again, if you go to that arrow at the top of a column, select and get that menu. If you hit text filter, you can then get a little text box, and if you click regular expressions, you can enter, and I'm pointing like you could actually see this. You can enter a regular expression, and this particular one that I used will return all dates that are in that format. And I wanted to convert those dates to, the ISO format, year, dash month, dash day. But this allowed me to narrow down the set of data to just those with that format, and I could operate on those in a batch operate, like I'm a surgeon. So I could also transform them in bulk using find and replace. So again, back to that menu in the column, instead of clicking text filter, you can, once you've already filtered them down, and you have that subset of your data, you can transform them. And here's a view of the transform box. And this is a different set of data, but I could take data that was, a range, comma, random year outlier, and normalize that by just taking the first and the last date, isolating them, putting them together, separating them by that slash that makes the date more machine readable. So here are some, maybe it's a little easier to see these. Can anyone even read these? Yeah, oh, okay, all right. So here's the most useful regular expressions for dealing with dates is you have that A to Z gets you any letter, upper or lowercase. If you append like the curly brackets with a number, that will give you that specific number of letters. You can do the same thing with a digit. So I shouldn't say date, that should say digit, but /D gets you any date, /D with 4 will get you a 4-digit date. So you just want the years, or you just want year, dash month. You can narrow all that down so you're working with like data, which makes it so much easier and less messy to try and convert dates with that. There's also this little caret means it begins with a date, and there's also, I think if you use a $sign, that tells you if, it ends. So you can give it a complete thing and say, I don't want anything that's longer than this or begins with something different. And Oxygen does a lot of these same regular expressions. So that skill is portable between tools. RegXer.com is one of my favorite tools for learning regex. I did not start out knowing regular expressions. I learned it on this project. And they have a great interface with a cheat sheet, and you can also copy over text and try out regular expressions in their interface, and it will highlight the text that you are telling, that the regular expression is telling it to. Okay. So onto some tools that I used. That was just for accession. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about tools that I used for CSV metadata for resources. I can't remember how many years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, University of Maryland acquired the AFL-CIO collection, and that was more so not just getting a collection, but getting an entire archives dumped on us with all of the data that went with it. So it wasn't like we got a finding aid, it was we got a database dump from, their metadata had been stored in an Eloquent database, and that's the brand, not a word an adjective I would use to describe the database. But so we had tons and tons of data in spreadsheets in CSV form, and like our resource metadata or finding a level metadata in the Beast, that was in an Access database, so theoretically we could get that out in CSV, but we already had a black box Java converter. That's a whole other story, but no one knew what it was. It was a million years old. No one wanted to touch it. So we couldn't really reuse that technology for this AFL-CIO collection. So, and at the time that we started working on this project, all of the plugins for importing finding aids were still in infancy, and none of us were developed enough in ArchivesSpace to create our own and make it work. So required developer time that was not available, or developer ability that was not available in my case. So we had heard about and played with a tool called Steady. Has anyone heard of this? Yes, cool. It was created by Jason Rinaldo at North Carolina State University. His email's down there. He's really cool. And this tool takes a CSV. Oh, I blocked off the CSV upload, but it takes a CSV file. You can add some, well, it's further down. You can add some collection level metadata in the form, upload the CSV file of a collection inventory, and it will give you EAD XML, which could then get imported into ArchivesSpace. But it didn't capture as much detail as we wanted because we had the metadata, we wanted to use it, we didn't want to have to manually import it after the fact. And also you had to do it one at a time, which is not ideal when you're dealing with more than a dozen. It gets a little old. So that's the URL that will take you directly to that page, and you can play around with it yourself if you've got a collection inventory. It does require a specific schema, so you have to have, you'd have to map your collection inventories to these values, but he also provides a sample CSV that you can download and work on mapping your collections into that. So I liked Steady a lot, so I started digging, and I wondered, could I alter Steady to include that extra metadata that I had? So then I looked in GitHub at the repository, and I'm not a programmer. This was a fool's errand, but I did it anyways. Steady is actually a wrapper that worked with a Ruby gem that Jason Rinaldo had created that's called sted, which stands for Spreadsheets to Encoded Archival Description. So sted was what was actually doing the heavy lifting and the converting, and then Steady was the mechanism passing that data back and forth between the user and the gem. So I began looking into it more. Since it required a pretty specific CSV template, I had my GA work on mapping collection inventories to an updated template. And in the meantime, I rolled up my sleeves and started getting comfy with Ruby. So I copied the GitHub repository to my machine and began exploring. So the first thing I did is I wanted to include additional collection level metadata that was not captured in that initial form. So I added arguments, and when I say arguments, when you run the program, it's just feeding it additional input. So I'm not fighting. I was fighting with it, but that's not what I'm talking about there. So I got lost in my notes there. Yes, so I was able to add arguments for including a resource ID, the extent, the scope and content nodes, and all of that metadata at the collection level, which I couldn't initially do. And I also could parse out dates at that level for normalization. So that's just a snippet of how I added those arguments. So I used XPath to say, hey, you're gonna add it to those locations in the EAD XML during the transformation. Using XPath. And just a quick recap on XPath, it's like a map. You're taking a map to navigate the tree of XML, what branch do you need to land on. So in addition to accommodating additional collection metadata at the command line, I was able to modify the script to handle all the additional metadata we had. We had a lot of sub-series metadata, which was not captured in the original sted schema, so I was able to to add a lot of that. This looks at, I think, series level, but I also broke out a lot of the series level metadata to be a little bit more precise because we had it. And so it went from 25 lines of code. Let's see, hold on, let me go back. Yeah, it went from there to needing a couple pages to get through it all. That's a lot of code, you don't want to read that, but I'm like, I did it. So I did make the script more precise and accommodated more metadata in that transformation, which meant less manual work down the road. So what I liked about Steady is that if you're not comfortable digging into the code, you can do it one at a time. It's a little bit burdensome, but it's probably less burdensome than like hand keying something in, right? Especially with some of those longer inventories. And if you have development support, you can always approach them and say, hey, there's this tool on GitHub. Can you, help me play around with it some? So Steady is a great tool for CSV data. And one very important lesson that I've learned, in addition to that iteration of having to go over my data multiple times, was reuse. Reuse your own work, reuse someone else's work, repurpose other things that you found and see if you can tweak them to work for this thing that kind of worked for that thing. Don't start from scratch if you don't have to. And another thing that I've learned along the way is that the ArchivesSpace community is very welcoming. A lot of the developers and the core committers are very helpful, and someone always seems to be available with tips and tricks and are non-judgmental if you don't know what you're doing. I found a lot of support in that community being like, I'm trying to write this script and I don't know what this does, and it's like the most basic Python package in the world. They've been very helpful. So to wrap up, open refine, yay, normalization, controlled vocabs, regular expressions, it's awesome. Steady instead, also awesome for converting CSV to EAD XML. And for real, please get in touch with any questions you have about anything I've talked about, because I not so secretly love doing this. And I'm happy to try and answer questions or brainstorm with you on how to work with your CSV data. If I don't know what to do, I'm happy to brainstorm with you on how to make it work. So do you want to go back to your thing? I think we've got...
Yeah, we left 20 minutes for questions and answers on purpose, to have more interactive, I think, discussion. I had one big question already to ask Celia, but if you have more to show.
Sure, I can just run through it real quick. So one of the things I noticed at the time I was doing this in 2016, the Mark importer was pretty terrible. I don't know if other people had this experience too, and there were a lot of Mark fields that were just silently dropped. So they weren't being importing, and they weren't importing, and there wasn't an error message; it just disappeared. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do was get a list of every single tag that was being used, so that I could check whether or not it was importing. And I was also checking to see how frequently a tag was being used. I was only importing about 300 Mark records. And so there were cases where a big one I remember was the 555 field, other finding aids note, just wasn't being imported at all. But I was only using it in 6 Mark records, so I just changed it manually. But I wanted to check to make sure I knew what was happening with my data. So I started out with this ImportExport Map, but I made a local copy and was, kind of fact checking as I went along. Next slide. But yeah, so first I wanted to just find all the tags in my files. And so this was really easy. I just looked for the expression tag equals and find it in all of my Mark files, Mark XML files. And then I got these results in Oxygen. You can see that they're on the right, and I saved the results. Next slide. And so that brings the results into XML, and it looks really ugly, so you can see each of them. So this is telling me where it is. Here is what is showing up. This is reminding you what you're looking for, and it's telling you where it's starting and the length and all that. But that isn't useful to me. I can't really do that much with it. So I wrote a tiny Excel formula that is basically just, so that's what I have in column B there, where I'm just saying, look for where it says tag and then return to me the 3 characters after that. So this looks really ugly if you're not used to Excel, but that's all it's doing. And so then you can see in my column B, whenever it has the tag value, it's showing up. Otherwise, it's giving me an error in Excel, but that's fine. And the next screen, so then I just copied all of those over into another tab, and I just sorted it and removed duplicates. And those are easy functions in Excel, and then I just had a list of all of my tags. So then I could check whether or not those tags were importing into ArchivesSpace, and if it wasn't importing, I would see how many times the field was occurring and decide whether it was worth changing manually. And I would also create a Jerrod ticket so that the ASpace folks know where the problems are. So that was a very laborious process, but it gave me great peace of mind because I knew that no data was being lost.
Did you have instances where like just subfields were getting dropped?
I'm trying to remember. I remember having a big, I'm sorry, I did this like 2 years ago. I had a big problem with my 700 fields, and I think it's been fixed now. So we had things that were like contributing. I'm also not a MARC person, so I learned a lot about MARC just doing this process.
Very sorry.
Yeah. ArchivesSpace doesn't do a great job of representing contributing authors, so my 700 fields weren't importing, and then so I, as a non-cataloger, was like, oh, I'll just change all the 700s to 600s, and I'll just import them that way. And then I told my coworkers that, and I saw like 4 simultaneous heart attacks, and so then I had to go back through and fix them in the API, adding the contributing role to all of those. So that was a nightmare.
I feel like MarcEdit has a function that counts those fields and like will give you the
Awesome.
of that thing, if I recall correctly, that you can have it do that and give it. I think it may also include subfields, so it'll be a little more.
Awesome. So just repeating for the recording, I put a lot of unnecessary effort into this. MarcEdit has a function that will list all of your fields for you. Thank you. That is good to know.
It may not have been in at the time you're using it.
That's charitable of you.
Yeah.
So we just did almost exactly the same thing at Columbia, following very, very, very similar steps, slightly different tooling. But one thing that was really helpful is we're hosted, and Lyrasis was doing a lot of the migration for us. And what they were able to do is actually tweak the import and export a little bit so that we were running into some issues. Some fields weren't coming in. The processing that was going down to 500 instead of 583, we were able to get them to actually tweak our templates a little bit, and that was actually really useful. So I just wanted to shout out their system there. If you are hosted, they can help with that.
So just to repeat for the recording, at Columbia, they are hosted on Lyrasis, and so when they noticed fields weren't importing, they told Lyrasis, and Lyrasis actually tweaked the importer. And actually, I'll say when I did this, I had an import plugin from, I want to say it was Duke, but I kind of forget. Because at the time, actually, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but imports were defaulting to unpublished, and I wanted all of my, everything to be published. And so I was using this plugin that someone else had developed, and I told him when I had problems. I think it was Noah Huffman.
Yes, I think so too.
Plugin. Yeah, and I told him, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll just fix that for you." So again, shout out to the wonderful ArchivesSpace community.
I have a question about agent imports.
Oh yeah, good luck.
So you just mentioned that. So I'm relying on my EAD XML as my authoritative source and use the importer to do that work. So I naively assume that there is elegant handling of agent records in this conversion from EAD. So how do you approach
Subject and agent, this is something I probably should have talked about and didn't. Subject and agent imports are terrible. And the other part of this migration process was that after everything was imported, we had a fleet of student workers go through and manually clean up our subjects and agents list following some rules that our metadata librarian wrote, but it was a very manual, time-consuming process. So what we did for agents actually were easier because we imported whatever junk we had, and then we took those results in basically took the list that I got. We have an ODBC access connection, so I looked at my agents list and I made a report for our cataloger. She brought it into OpenRefine and ran a process through OpenRefine. I don't know how to do this, but I know you can do
So
it. Reconciliation against the LC authorities. Mm-hmm. So she got the authority IDs out of there, and then I imported all of those authorities. So I did a batch process through the API to import the authority records, and you can import authorities as the MARC records for authorities. And so then we did something pretty complicated with that, but yeah, there's a session actually right after this about library style authority control, and I'm really looking forward to that because I would not recommend anyone follow that method that I just described.
Yeah.
So I'm going to lead that session. It's going to sound a lot like this.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right, I feel good. So that's the best there is. Good luck, everyone.
I will say for OpenRefine, I learned this recently in a class so it's actually not like live data in OpenRefine, so you can still play around with all this normalization and see how things work, and then you finally export your stuff as your kind of destination data, right? Mm-hmm. So OpenRefine itself, you think you're actually massaging the data in real time, but you're not. It kind of caches it, which I didn't know, and so I said, what do you do with all this stuff?
Yeah, you can
export it, right?
You can export it, and you can export it in more than just CSV, depending on what your needs are. And one thing that I really love about OpenRefine is I don't think you can see it in any of my screenshots. Nope. But at the top of the page, there's two little tabs. It's on the left near the top, and you can go to undo redo, and you can just walk yourself back through and be like, what did I do? And kind of find your way back to when the data looked right again. And you can also actually you can export your whole activity history. So if you do back yourself out, it will tell you what you know what you had done. So if you need to skip 4 steps and then start again, it'll help you remember what you did. Yeah. And another point about the getting the agents out, reconciling, everything like that. I do think there are also some scripts. I think that Johns Hopkins does a similar thing. I don't know if they maybe don't have an ODBC connection, but they go through, find all the agents, have a CSV file, then run a reconciliation against, I can't remember if they use VIAF or LC, through a Python script, and then another script to upload it back. So there's more than one way to scan an agent record. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the subject and agents are definitely the hardest part.
Absolutely.
And what I do now, actually, if I find a spare file, is I strip the agents and subjects, import the rest of the file, and then do those manually, because I think it just keeps the data cleaner.
I was going to mention also I know the agents module is being redeveloped for ArchivesSpace. Last year there was a session on it as part of the member forum. I'm not sure where it is now. If anyone else knows more details, but because currently it does not support ACC at all. So what we're all talking about now is basically MARC. authority or equivalent. So,
Or EAD.
well,
I mean,
EAD doesn't do it.
yeah, that's the problem with the EAD is it's just not.
It's not, it's
not
basically
segmented.
equivalent to mark the graphic records. And
It's only a string.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not field
Exactly.
Yeah.
names.
That's part
Yeah.
of the issue, I think. So, well, you know, hopefully that agents want to redesign, which, because currently, if you want to use the HCCPS, you really can't in ArchivesSpace, so, or at least not internally. So.
Well, originally, we had discovered we had a lot of subject mandatory records that we thought were all cool, but they had not been imported into OCLC in our cataloging department, and so they were approved internally. When we started putting things in OCLC, they were just not authorized, and so we're working with our imported catalogers. And she is going through the EAD files we have, going backwards by the date when the last was updated. And she is correcting the terms and then importing those into ArchivesSpace. So that when we import the files, you know, we can strip them and do it that way. So that, and you know, that way she can check and, you know, if the term isn't correct, you know, she tells us.
She's correcting it in the EAD files?
No.
Oh, good.
She's corrected it in the MARC record.
In the MARC,
So
okay.
when the MARC record reports, it will have all the correct terms.
Yeah.
And then we have common, you know, ID, you know, for each one. So that's kind of our plan right now.
So you pre-imported all your subject and agent records
Mhm.
with authority files and then matched your EAD
Right,
ingest on those, right?
because all of the catalog records, MARC records will be correct.
Right.
And so we import those, we strip them out of the EAD file, so, and they'll match up by the central ID number that we're supposed to do.
One word of caution, I'm not totally sure for the MARC export. I know for the EAD export, even if your EAD file specifies the authority source, that doesn't import. And I think it might be the same for MARC too. I think it always says unspecified ingest source. So if you do actually want to track that, you have to go in through the API or whatever makes sense and make those changes.
She's doing that.
Yeah.
So, she volunteered.
Yeah.
You also, as a project manager, one of the challenges is often there's too much information out there. Everyone has done their own special sauce. It's hard to kind of winnow down all the resources that are out there. So I kind of have a list going of all the things I want to do with particular data elements and kind of track them that way. But I often get frustrated, you know, with how is ArchivesSpace going to handle this data, both as an import and as an export, because we have a dependency on export. So I want to know, how does the ArchivesSpace EAD exporter handle this same data? Is it going to be the same data as that I put in, or am I going to get it out again? So I have this giant list of bookmark URLs of either plugins or code repositories or blog spots that are often overwhelming to me sometimes.
And it's a moving target.
Exactly. So there's so much churn in the code base as well. It mentions the agents is changing, and everything is there's like when's a good time to actually hit the go button? For me, is also a big challenge. And how to communicate with your developer staff if you don't have control over your ArchivesSpace instance, or if you're hosting. I don't know how the hosting part works at all. So can you do all this if you're hosting ArchivesSpace from Neurosys? Is that can you still manipulate this data the same way if you're?
I mean,
They'll do it for you if
all
you're.
that stuff for you.
Okay.
And I mean, you work with. I haven't had to do a lot of that detailed stuff, but I've had really good experience just having them being really responsive on, the questions I have.
Okay.
And to that, I know at Columbia we specifically asked for full API access, so we do a lot of that work via the API.
That was my next question was, do you have API access to your
Yeah.
hosting? You have to ask for it independently?
Yeah, it's in our contracts, which was
Okay.
done before I got there, but that was very specifically in there, so I suspect that was something that we asked for.
Yeah, and I will tell everyone, always ask for a development server in addition to the production server, because even if you think, I'm afraid of the API, I don't know how to do it, I'm never going to know how to do it, it's easier than you think. You might change your mind. You might want to be able to use it for just one or two things. You might have a colleague or someone else who gets hired who wants to do it. So I think it's really important, and it takes a lot of the fear away if you know that you're not going to break anything. One other thing that I was thinking about when you were showing sted is depending on what your data looks like, if you have CSV files that you want to be in an EAD format, it can be pretty easy to just do it yourself. And I use Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel to just tell it, this column is my title. So take this column and add, unit title, and then whatever's in this, and then unit title again. So I don't know if anyone has had experience with that, but it's pretty simple.
I mean, that was staying does basically, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
but if steady doesn't accommodate your needs, rather than editing, if you don't feel comfortable going
into Ruby.
Yeah, this is a very simple thing you can do.
Yeah, and I wasn't alone in it. I had a field study student come on for the summer who wanted to learn some metadata related programming, and I was like, let's do this. So I had help.
And the other thing I wanted to mention, what I've forgotten already. Oh, Transmog. If you have, just a shout out, if you have Microsoft Word files that are finding aids that you need to convert, apparently there are conflicting reports about the usefulness of this tool, but there is a tool called Transmog that someone made, and it's on the internet somewhere, and you can find it, that supposedly automatically converts Word docs into EAD.
So yeah, I tried that on, I think, Thursday. So it's a tool from UVA, and it hasn't been updated in several years, but it tripped up on every single strange ASCII character that I had, and just gave you kind of a weird, strange JSON-y like error message, but in Java. Even more harder to interpret sometimes, and I just couldn't get it to really work. But we were hoping to have some advice about if you had non-structured data, how do you handle it? But it may be better to try to get into a CSV format somehow. If it's just a blob text, it's probably easier to work with in a tabular type of fashion than just as uncontrolled text. So I also learned kind of the ArchivesSpace will suddenly drop things, will also suddenly add things to you. So Bria's example of all for linear footage permutations, those will all become new values in your ArchivesSpace instance. I was like, what is this weird thing that came into ArchivesSpace? How did it get there? Oh, it just added my extent string. So I had to parse my extent string 2 times to isolate both the numerical value and then all the other just human readable contextual information to a separate extent.
Yeah, I didn't really say why the normalization was necessary, but yeah.
So again, I'm kind of iteratively going through these things and discovering these things kind of silently, which is a challenge, right? You certainly can't give a developer this kind of thing because they'll just freak out. And they're so, I need documentation for this. Well, there is none. You have to learn by trying. And my developers at my institution will not do that, right? So as a project manager, I need to figure that ahead of time as a project manager to then give use cases and feature tasks to a developer to do this or do it myself.